When I first met Margaret, I could tell immediately that she didn't like me. It wasn't the obvious kind of dislike. No glares, no outright insults, but a quieter, more insidious form of disapproval. The way her lips pressed together in a forced smile, the slight hesitation before she responded to anything I said, the way her eyes flicked to Ethan as if silently questioning his choices. At the time, I told myself I was imagining it. It's normal for a mother to be protective of her son, I thought. Maybe she just needed time to warm up to me. Ethan reassured me constantly, telling me she was a little old-fashioned but would come around. I wanted to believe him, so I pushed aside my discomfort and did my best to win her over. Our first dinner together should have been a red flag. Ethan and I had been dating for almost a year when he invited me to his mother's house for dinner. I remember standing in her kitchen, offering to help, while she moved with the kind of efficiency that told me she didn't actually want my assistance. "Oh, don't worry about it, dear," she said in a tone that was meant to sound kind but carried an unmistakable undertone of condescension. "I'm sure you're not used to cooking like this." I wasn't sure what she meant by like this. Cooking at all? Cooking from scratch? Cooking in a way that met her impossibly high standards? I had no idea. I wasn't a bad cook, but something in the way she said it made me feel inadequate. Throughout dinner, she asked me polite but pointed questions. "So, what exactly do you do, again?" "I'm in marketing," I said, giving her the same answer I always did. She nodded as if she understood, but then turned to Ethan and said, "I suppose that's very different from what you do. You've always been such a hard worker." Ethan and I both noticed the implication. She didn't see my job as real work. He squeezed my hand under the table in silent reassurance, but I felt the sting. It didn't stop there. Margaret had a way of making comments that seemed innocent on the surface but carried a deeper meaning. "That dress is lovely," she said once, her eyes scanning me with thinly veiled judgment. "It must be nice not to worry about practicality." Or the time she saw me reading on my phone while waiting for dinner to be served and said, "Ah, the younger generation, always glued to technology. When I was your age, we actually spoke to one another." When Ethan and I got engaged, I had foolishly hoped that would change things. That maybe, once I became officially part of the family, Margaret would warm up to me. If anything, it made things worse. She didn't try to talk Ethan out of marrying me. Not directly, at least. But I could tell she wasn't happy. She insisted on being involved in the wedding planning, offering advice that was more like veiled criticism. "You know, in our family, we've always done things a certain way," she said when I mentioned wanting a smaller, more intimate wedding. "Tradition is important." When I picked a dress that was simpler than what she expected, she sighed and said, "Well, I suppose it's your day." By the time we were married, I had given up on trying to impress her. No matter what I did, it wasn't enough. She had a perfect vision of what her son's wife should be, and I didn't fit the mold. I wasn't from the same social circle, I didn't have the same values, and I certainly wasn't as refined as she expected. But Ethan loved me. That was what mattered, right? The real problems started after the wedding, when Margaret began testing the limits of our marriage. It started small. She would drop by unannounced, always with some excuse. "I was just in the neighborhood. I thought you might need some help organizing the kitchen." Or my personal favorite, "I wanted to make sure Ethan was eating well." She had a way of making these visits seem normal, but I knew what she was doing. She wanted to remind me that no matter what, she was still the most important woman in Ethan's life. When we bought our first house, she criticized every choice I made. "You painted the living room that color, it's very modern. You bought that couch? Well, if it's comfortable, I suppose that's all that matters." Ethan did his best to keep the peace. He called her out when she was being passive-aggressive, but Margaret always played the innocent card. "Oh, Ethan, don't be so sensitive. I was just offering some advice." It was exhausting, and the worst part? I started to doubt myself. Maybe she was right. Maybe I wasn't a good enough wife. Maybe I wasn't taking care of Ethan the way she thought I should. She had decades more experience than me. Who was I to argue? I started second-guessing my decisions, trying to anticipate what Margaret might say before she said it. I adjusted my behavior, hoping that if I just did everything right, she'd finally approve of me. But it didn't matter what I did. She always found something to criticize. One evening, after an especially tense dinner at her house, Ethan finally snapped. "Mom, enough," he said, his voice firm. "You're always finding something wrong with what she does. It's not fair." Margaret looked genuinely surprised. "Oh, Ethan, that's not true. I only want the best for you." "No," he said, shaking his head. "You want control." For a moment, I thought that would be the turning point, that maybe, just maybe, Margaret would realize how much she was hurting me. But instead, she just sighed and gave me that same tight-lipped smile. I suppose I can't say anything without being the bad guy. That was when I knew she would never change. She didn't hate me because of anything I did. She hated me because I took Ethan away from her. And the worst part? I had no idea how much worse things were about to get. I didn't find the letter because I was looking for it. If anything, I had spent most of my marriage trying not to uncover anything that would deepen the tension between me and Margaret. But fate, or maybe sheer bad luck, had other plans. It happened on an overcast afternoon when Ethan and I were at Margaret's house helping her clear out some of the clutter in her attic. She had been complaining about the mess for years, though in reality it was just a collection of old furniture, dusty boxes, and carefully preserved memories she refused to let go of. Ethan and I had finally convinced her to sort through it all, arguing that it would make her life easier. Margaret, of course, didn't lift a finger. She sat in an old armchair near the attic door, sipping tea as she supervised our work. Every so often, she'd point at a box and say, "Oh, not that one, dear. That has sentimental value," or, "Oh, be careful with that. It belonged to my grandmother." She never offered specifics, only vague statements that made it clear she wanted us to organize without actually getting rid of anything. I was sorting through a stack of old books when I noticed a small wooden box tucked away behind a pile of faded blankets. It looked different from the rest of the storage. Newer, like it had been placed there more recently. Something about it made me pause. "Hey, what's this?" I asked, holding it up. Margaret barely glanced at it. "Oh, just an old keepsake box, nothing important." But when I tried to open it, I realized it was locked. A locked box in an attic full of forgotten things. That, in itself, was strange. If it was nothing important, why lock it? Why keep it hidden? I glanced at Ethan, who was busy sorting through a box of his childhood toys. He didn't seem to notice anything unusual. For a moment, I hesitated. It wasn't my place to snoop. Margaret already resented me enough. I didn't need to add to her list of grievances. But something about the box gnawed at me. Maybe it was because, deep down, I had always felt like Margaret was hiding something. That her hostility toward me wasn't just about me, but something bigger, something unspoken. Before I could think twice, I turned it over in my hands, searching for a way in. The lock was old but simple, and with a little pressure, the latch gave way. The lid popped open with a soft click. Inside was a bundle of aged papers folded neatly. My fingers trembled slightly as I lifted the first one. It was a letter. Yellowed with time, the ink slightly faded but still legible. I scanned the first few lines, my heart beginning to race. "Dear Robert, I know we said we would never speak of this again, but I can't keep pretending. The guilt is unbearable. I see him every day and I know the truth. I know he isn't yours." I stopped breathing. "Him? He isn't yours?" I read further, my pulse pounding. "If you ever tell him, it will ruin everything. I need you to understand. I did what I had to do. I had no choice." The signature at the bottom was unmistakable. "Margaret." I reread the letter 3 times before my brain could process what I was seeing. There was no mistaking what it implied. Ethan's father, Robert, wasn't his biological father. Margaret had been hiding something massive. I quickly shuffled through the other papers. Some were medical records, some letters exchanged between Margaret and an unknown recipient. The words, "our mistake," appeared more than once. A few referenced a man's name I didn't recognize. I felt dizzy. This was the kind of secret that could destroy a family, and I was holding it in my hands. My first instinct was to put everything back, to pretend I had never seen it, but I couldn't unsee it now. I knew, and if I knew, I had a responsibility to tell Ethan. Margaret must have noticed my silence because she finally looked up from her tea. "What is it?" she asked, her voice sharp. I quickly folded the letter and set it back inside the box. "Nothing," I said, forcing a smile. "Just some old papers." Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly, and for the first time I saw something I had never seen in her before. Not irritation, not smug superiority. She knew. She knew exactly what I had found. "Some things are best left in the past," she said after a long pause, her tone deceptively calm. I nodded, pretending to agree, but inside my mind was racing. Because I knew one thing for certain, Margaret's past was no longer staying buried. I didn't tell Ethan right away. Not because I wanted to keep it from him, but because I didn't know how to tell him. How do you tell someone that their entire life, their entire identity might be based on a lie? How do you break something so fundamental? For the rest of the day, I could barely focus. Margaret watched me like a hawk, her usual condescending demeanor replaced by something more cautious, almost calculating. She knew I had read the letter, and I could feel her silently daring me to say something. But I didn't. Not yet. That night, back at home, I sat on the edge of our bed, staring at my phone, my mind racing. Should I call someone? Research the name I had seen in the letters? Find some way to verify the truth before I said anything? Ethan noticed my mood immediately. He sat down beside me, nudging me gently. "You've been quiet since we left my mom's," he said. "Something happen?" I hesitated. This was the moment before everything changed. I took a deep breath. "Ethan, I found something in your mom's attic today." He frowned. "What do you mean?" I pulled out my phone, where I had snapped a photo of the letter when Margaret wasn't looking. I handed it to him without a word. As he read, I watched his expression shift. Confusion, shock, disbelief. "What is this?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "It's a letter from your mom. To your dad." His eyes flicked back to the screen, rereading the words as if hoping they would change. "This has to be a mistake. Maybe it's about someone else." I shook my head. "Ethan, I don't think it is." Silence. For a long time he just sat there, staring at nothing. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet. "I need to talk to her." I reached for his hand, but he pulled away, standing up abruptly. I could see it in his posture, the way his shoulders tensed, the way his breathing quickened. He was unraveling. "Ethan, wait," I said, standing up too. "We don't know the full story yet. Maybe—" "I don't care," he interrupted. "She's been lying to me. My whole life she's been lying to me." He was right. There was no way around it. The letter was clear. Margaret had known. She had chosen to keep this from him, and now, after all these years, it was about to come crashing down. Ethan didn't sleep that night. Neither did I. He was restless, pacing the house, his mind spinning through possibilities. What if it was true? What if his father wasn't his biological father? What did that even mean for him, for his identity? By morning, he had made up his mind. He was going to confront Margaret. I offered to go with him, but he refused. "I need to do this alone," he said. So I waited and waited. Every passing hour felt like an eternity. When he finally came back, his face was pale, his eyes red-rimmed. He looked exhausted, like someone who had just gone through a battle. "She admitted it," he said quietly. I sucked in a breath. "Everything?" He nodded. "My dad, Robert, wasn't my real father. She had an affair. When she got pregnant, she convinced Robert that I was his. He never questioned it. Or if he did, he never said anything." I swallowed hard. Who was the other man?" Ethan hesitated before answering. "His name was James Holloway. He was my dad's business partner." The name sent a shiver down my spine. That was the name I had seen in the letters. the man Margaret had written to. I didn't know what to say. I couldn't imagine what Ethan was feeling. Learning that the man who raised him, the man he had called Dad, wasn't actually his father. That his entire family history had been built on a lie. "I don't even know who I am anymore," he whispered. I wrapped my arms around him, holding him tight. "You're still you, Ethan. This doesn't change that." But I knew that wasn't true. It did change things, and we both knew it. The days following Ethan's confrontation with Margaret were a blur. He barely spoke. He moved through life on autopilot, going to work, coming home, eating dinner in silence. I didn't push him to talk. What could I even say? He had spent his entire life believing in one version of himself, only to have it ripped away in an instant. His mother, the woman who raised him, who had shaped his understanding of family and loyalty, had lied to him. And not just a small lie, a foundational one. Margaret didn't try to call him. She didn't reach out. Maybe she was giving him space, or maybe she didn't know what to say either. Ethan refused to be the one to make the first move. He was still too raw, too angry. But I could feel it, the storm brewing beneath his quiet demeanor. He wasn't just upset. He was lost. One night as we lay in bed in the dark, he finally spoke. His voice was quiet, almost hesitant. "I keep thinking about my dad." I turned toward him. "Robert?" He nodded. All those years, did he know? Did he ever suspect? I didn't have an answer. Maybe. Or maybe he loved you so much that it didn't matter. Ethan exhaled sharply. That's the thing. He was a good dad. He was always there. Football games, school plays, everything. He worked long hours, but he never made me feel like I wasn't his priority. And now I don't even know if I was really his son. I reached for his hand. "Family isn't just biology, Ethan." "I know," he said, but he sounded unconvinced. A few days later, I came home to find Ethan on his laptop, staring at a website I didn't recognize. "What are you looking at?" I asked. He hesitated before answering. "DNA tests." I swallowed. "Are you sure you want to do that?" He nodded. "I need to know for sure. I need to see it in black and white." I didn't try to talk him out of it. I understood he needed closure, something concrete in the face of the uncertainty his mother had created. He ordered the test that night. When it arrived a few days later, he took the sample without hesitation and sent it off. Then came the hardest part, waiting. During that time, I started noticing something strange. Margaret had stopped coming around completely. No calls, no visits, not even the passive-aggressive texts she used to send. It was as if she had disappeared. At first, I was relieved, but then I started to wonder. Margaret had always been the type to push her way into Ethan's life, whether he wanted her there or not. Silence wasn't like her. So I did something I never thought I would do. I went to see her myself. When she opened the door, her expression was unreadable. For the first time, she didn't look at me with disdain or annoyance. She just looked tired. "I was wondering when you'd show up," she said, stepping aside to let me in. Her house, usually immaculate, looked different. Messier, like she had stopped caring. Margaret sat down on the couch, rubbing her temples. "I suppose Ethan told you everything." I sat across from her. "He did." She sighed. "I never wanted him to find out this way." I studied her face, searching for remorse. "Why did you lie to him?" Margaret was quiet for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was almost too soft to hear. "Because I was afraid." "Afraid of what?" She let out a bitter laugh. "Of losing everything." She looked at me then, her gaze sharp but not unkind. "You think I hated you, don't you?" I hesitated before nodding. "Yes." She sighed. "I didn't hate you. I envied you." That took me by surprise. "What?" Margaret leaned back, staring at the ceiling. "You and Ethan. You have the kind of marriage I always wanted. The kind I never had." I didn't know what to say. I loved James, she admitted suddenly, more than I ever loved Robert. But James wasn't the kind of man who would have stayed. He was selfish, reckless. When I found out I was pregnant, I knew he wouldn't step up, so I made a choice. I chose security. I chose stability. I chose Robert. She glanced at me, her expression unreadable. And I never regretted it. Not until the day Robert died. Because that was the day I realized I had built my life on a lie. And once you start lying, it never stops. I swallowed hard. Why take it out on me? Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. Because you reminded me of everything I didn't have. Ethan chose you. He loves you, without hesitation, without conditions, and that terrified me. Silence filled the room. I stood up. Ethan needs time, but shutting him out won't fix anything. Margaret nodded slowly. I know. A week later, Ethan's DNA results arrived. He opened them with shaking hands. It was confirmed. James Holloway was his biological father. Ethan didn't cry. He just sat there, staring at the screen. Then, after a long silence, he turned to me. I want to meet him. I wasn't surprised. Are you sure? He nodded. I need to see him. Just once. It took some effort, but we found James. He was still alive, living a few states away. When Ethan reached out, James agreed to meet. I went with them. We met at a small diner off the highway. James was older now, his once dark hair streaked with gray. He looked like Ethan in a way Robert never had. The meeting was underwhelming. James wasn't cruel, but he wasn't particularly warm either. He admitted to the affair, said he had suspected but never wanted to know for sure. I'm not the fatherly type, he admitted, stirring his coffee. Never was. But it looks like you turned out fine. Ethan nodded, expression unreadable. I did, thanks to Robert. James didn't argue, he just nodded. Then I guess he was your real dad. When we left the diner, Ethan didn't say much, but as we drove away, he reached for my hand. Let's go home. And that was it. That was all he needed. Not closure, not a deep connection with James, just the understanding that biology wasn't everything. When we got home, Ethan did something I didn't expect. He called Margaret. The conversation was short, but when he hung up, he turned to me with a small, tired smile. She wants to talk. It would take time. Maybe things would never be the same. But for the first time since this all started, I felt like we were moving forward. Margaret had spent her life protecting a secret, fearing the moment it would unravel. And in the end, it had unraveled. It had broken everything apart. But from the wreckage, something new was taking shape. A different kind of family. One built on honesty, not lies.